I had 100 days to transform this empty, forgotten coastline into a thriving Viking city. I wanted enormous longships waiting in the harbor, massive wooden walls protecting the settlements, rows of Viking homes, a gigantic marketplace, and a tavern for returning warriors. But there was only one small problem. This was Minecraft Hardcore. One careless mining trip, one unexpected creeper, or one badly timed fall could erase the entire project forever. And considering how often I completely underestimated the size of my own builds, surviving might not have been the hardest part. This is how I survived 100 days in Minecraft Hardcore and built an entire Viking city. My adventure began in the middle of a swamp. At first, it did not exactly look like the ideal place to establish a Viking kingdom, but just beyond the swamp I noticed a stretch of open land besides the water that looked surprisingly promising. So I collected some wood, crafted the usual wooden tools, and quickly upgraded everything to stone. My next objective was finding coal and copper. Searching for coal during the opening minutes of a hardcore world might be one of the most dangerous activities in Minecraft. All it takes is one dark cave, one creeper standing behind you, and suddenly your 100-day adventure becomes a 6-minute video. Still, there is something strangely comforting about finding coal at the beginning of a new world. Copper was also much more useful in this world. It allowed me to create copper tools and armor. And even without the tools, copper was going to become one of the best looking roof materials available to me. Luckily, I soon discovered a small village nearby. One of its houses looked perfect as a temporary starter base, so I moved in without asking for permission. The villagers did not seem particularly bothered. The village also contained a huge amount of hay, which completely removed my early game food problems. Hay bales are honestly so powerful at the beginning of a survival world that using them almost feels illegal. With enough bread to feed a small army and a complete set of copper armor, I was finally somewhat protected. Somewhat. Before upgrading the rest of my equipment, I wanted to begin the project properly by constructing my first Viking-themed build. For that, I needed spruce wood. A lot of spruce wood. Unfortunately, spruce trees are among the most annoying trees in Minecraft to cut down. They are tall, covered in branches, and somehow always leave one piece of wood floating 10 blocks above the ground. But since almost the entire city was going to be built from spruce, I spent most of the day collecting it. I also knew that I would eventually need large amounts of wool and leather, especially for sails, banners, bookshelves and decorations. So I created a small animal farm beside the village. Getting the animals inside was going surprisingly well, until my carefully designed trapping system captured several villages instead. It was not exactly what I had planned, but at least the system worked. After gathering enough resources, I was ready to begin the first real build of the world. Naturally, I started with something small and reasonable: a Viking longship. The ship was going to represent a Viking expedition returning home. Of course, the city it was supposedly returning to did not exist yet, but that was a problem for future me. I began by marking the outline in the water. The underwater scenery in this shader pack looked incredible. I settled on a width of 7 blocks and started constructing the curved foundation of the hull. Building ships in Minecraft always feels strange at the beginning. You place a few random blocks in the water, stare at them for several minutes, and convince yourself that they will eventually resemble a boat. At this stage, mine looked more like a wooden banana. Still, I continued shaping the hull and filled in the lower deck. By the time the floor was finished, night had arrived. I had no interest in fighting drowned zombies while standing on half-finished wooden stairs, so I returned to the village and slept. The next morning, I continued working on the shape of the ship. There is always a point during a large Minecraft build where everything looks completely wrong. The proportions feel strange, the colors do not match, and you begin questioning every decision that brought you there. Sometimes you just have to believe in the process, and sometimes the build continues to look terrible. Fortunately, this one slowly began to improve. Once the hull was complete, I started working on the mast. I chose the classic red and white pattern that appears in almost every fictional Viking ship. Was it completely historically accurate? No. Did it look like a Viking ship? Absolutely. This was a fantasy Viking city, so historical accuracy was not going to prevent me from building something cool. Naturally, I forgot to sleep again. I considered running back to the village, but early hardcore nights are terrifying. A single zombie and a skeleton working together would have been enough to end the entire world. So instead, I waited on the ship until morning like a fearless Viking warrior. I finished the lower sections of the hull while trying to ignore a drowned zombie that had spent the entire night making disturbing noises beneath me. I eventually ran out of wool, so I returned to the farm, collected more, and completed the sail. When I stepped back and looked at the finished ship, I was honestly surprised by how well it had turned out. It was the first build of the world, and it immediately established the style I wanted for the entire project. I could have used the ship as my main base, but I had not come here to live on a boat. I had come here to build a city. With the longship completed, I could finally focus on improving my equipment. I began by planting sugarcane near the village. Eventually, I would need large amounts of paper for bookshelves, enchantments and trading. My short-lived Bronze Age was about to end. It was time to go mining. First mining expeditions are always the most dangerous part of a hardcore build. Later, when you have enchanted armor, powerful tools and several methods of escaping danger, the biggest threat is usually your own inability to avoid fall damage. Early in the game, however, one creeper could mean the end of your world. Normally, I would have strip mined until I found my first diamonds, but I discovered a large cave system, so I carefully made my way down, placed far more torches than I normally would, and searched the lower levels. Then I found diamonds. Mission accomplished. I finally had enough diamonds to craft one of the most important tools in Minecraft, 2 diamond shovels. Obviously, I crafted more practical equipment first. The cave turned out to be extremely profitable. I found more diamonds, iron, copper, and enough other resources to justify the risk. Hardcore mode completely changes the way you behave underground. In a normal survival world, I would have sprinted through the cave without placing torches, probably jumped into every dark opening I found. In hardcore, every sound made me stop moving. While leaving the cave, I noticed one diamond I had somehow walked past, and then discovered several more nearby. I also collected as much copper as possible. I did not need it for my buildings, but smelting copper provided a large amount of experience. It was essentially the poor man's version of an XP farm. Eventually, I returned to the village with a very successful collection of resources. Since I had so many ores to process, I built a furnace connecting to hoppers. This allowed me to smelt everything efficiently while storing the experience inside the furnace. The next stage of the project required choosing the location for the actual city. Before exploring, I spent several more days collecting spruce wood, since almost every building would use the same material palette. I planted 4 spruce saplings together whenever possible. Giant spruce trees are slightly annoying to cut down, but they provide wood much faster than individual trees. They do not always return enough saplings, but for pure wood production, they are extremely effective. While I was farming, I also expanded the sugarcane field. After another long day of cutting spruce, I had finally enough materials to begin the first few city buildings. During my exploration, I discovered the perfect location. The area contained a beautiful natural harbor, a rocky mountain, several hills, and enough uneven terrain to give the settlement a unique shape. It looked like the kind of place where a Viking city might have developed naturally over time. I placed the first blocks of my new headquarters besides one of the hills. The building was deliberately simple. It was only meant to provide storage, shelter, and a central location while I constructed everything around it. Even so, I used the same architectural style I wanted throughout the city. Spruce logs, wooden walls, a steep roof, and a few fantasy-inspired details. By the time I finished the basic structure, night had arrived. Luckily, my longship was nearby and provided me with a place to sleep. Since the city location was now confirmed, I returned to the village and transported every useful item from my original base. I emptied the chests, dismantled the temporary farm, and said goodbye to the cows that had supported me during the opening days. Their sacrifice would be remembered. The llamas also came with me. I had legally acquired them from a wandering trader. After moving everything into the new headquarters, I finished decorating the interior. One section of the natural hill besides the building looked perfect for an enchanting area, so I carved out a small room and placed the enchanting table inside. Then I attempted my first serious enchantments. I received protection 3 and efficiency 4. They could have been better, they could have been much worse. More importantly, I had a permanent base inside the future city. Now the real construction could begin. The natural harbor sat directly in front of my headquarters. It was going to become the center of the entire settlement. Before beginning, however, I needed to complete my first diamond armor and toolset. The village and its iron golem had protected me during the early game, but had now moved away from safety. If I wanted to survive the remaining days, copper armor was no longer enough, so I returned underground. This time I decided to create a proper mine shaft and strip mine at diamond level. Before I even reached the correct depth, I broke into another cave system. I collected several ores and was extremely happy to discover another group of diamonds. The experience from smelting everything gave me enough levels for an enchantment attempt. And this time I hit the jackpot. With my newly enchanted tools, strip mining became much faster. It was also extremely boring to watch, so I will spare you the full experience. After collecting enough diamonds, I returned to the surface with a complete set of equipment. Now I could finally begin the harbor. I started by placing vertical spruce logs along the coastline. Between each log, I left space for cobblestone sections. Above them, I used spruce planks and stairs to create curved supports beneath the harbor platform. The combination of stone and dark wood matched the Viking theme perfectly. I wanted the final city to create an immediate sense of scale, so I made the harbor much larger than I initially thought was necessary. The harbor also needed to prevent mobs from entering the city. More importantly, it had to stop future villagers from walking directly into the ocean. Villagers have an incredible talent for finding the most dangerous possible location and standing there permanently. To protect them from themselves, I placed slabs and spruce fence gates along the top of the wall. After several Minecraft days, the central section of the harbor was finally complete. It gave me a clear reference point for the rest of the city and helped establish where the main streets and buildings would be located. I connected the harbor walls to the natural terrain and calculated the materials required for the remaining sections. As usual, I had underestimated everything. I needed far more cobblestone and spruce wood, so I returned to farming. With enchanted tools, the process was much easier, but it still required destroying a ridiculous amount of trees and removing large portions of a mountain. Once my resources had been restocked, I began constructing the first major harbor building. From a role-playing perspective, I wanted the harbor to contain a workshop where timber, ship parts, tools and imported goods could be stored. Beside it, I planned to build a large crane for loading cargo onto ships. The workshop was designed as an enormous open-sided hall. Since it had very few walls, I made the roof tall and dramatic to give the structure some weight. I built a heavy wooden frame, expanded the platform, and slowly added smaller details to make the structure feel believable. Since this was a Viking-inspired fantasy build, I added curved wooden decorations to the roof. I did not know the correct name for them, but almost every Viking building in films, games and television appears to have them. So my city was getting them too. While constructing the workshop, I continued farming spruce between building sessions. There was never enough spruce. Once the workshop was finished, I turned my attention to the crane. I studied several different Minecraft crane designs and combined the elements I liked the most. The counterweight system looked especially impressive and made the structure feel functional rather than purely decorative. I also discovered that grindstones are severely underrated as building blocks. Their shape worked perfectly as part of the crane's mechanical structure. After several more days of construction, the entire harbor workshop was complete. The open hall, storage areas, crane, and the surrounding dock created exactly the industrial harbor atmosphere I had imagined. For the first time, the project was beginning to feel like a real-life settlement rather than a collection of unrelated builds. The workshop occupied one side of the harbor. The other side still looked empty. And since the city was supposed to be populated by thirsty Viking warriors returning from long expeditions, the next building had to be a tavern. I created a large platform besides the water and began measuring the available space. My plan included a tall main building with a smaller, open-sided extension besides it. I started with a long wooden framework that was narrow enough to fit beside the harbor while appearing substantial. Then I constructed the roof of the side extension first. This helped me judge how tall the central building needed to be. After several attempts, the proportions finally began to work. Maintaining a consistent architectural style across an entire city is surprisingly difficult. Every building needs to feel like it belongs in the same settlement. But if they all look identical, the city becomes repetitive. I used full spruce planks along the lower rows before transitioning into stairs near the top. This gave the roof more visual weight and prevented it from looking too thin. From the sides, the result looked exactly how I imagined it. Naturally, I added the wooden Viking horns to the roof. At this point, they had become the city's official architectural tradition. I spent a long time experimenting with windows, support beams, overhangs, and smaller decorative features. Eventually, everything came together. To make the tavern feel warm and welcoming, I added lanterns around the exterior. This also gave me an opportunity to confirm an important fact: lanterns are superior to torches. There will be no further discussion. The tavern also needed an outdoor seating area where the inhabitants could consume meat and meat while discussing the latest rates. I built several basic tables and benches, then used flower pots, item frames, and other small blocks to represent cups, plates, and food. The final result looked surprisingly convincing. Once the tavern was decorated, I returned to the workshop and added several machines, tools, and storage details. These decorations did not serve any real survival purpose, but they made the harbor feel much more active and immersive. The city now had a shipyard and a tavern. The workshop and tavern were much larger than the buildings I had originally planned, so I expanded the city. I extended the harbor walls using the same combination of spruce supports and cobblestone sections. At the same time, I started a sheep farm because I knew the harbor would eventually need several more additional ships. Each one required an enormous amount of wool. The harbor walls could not surround the entire island, so I needed to create a proper defensive wall around the landward side of the settlement. My design used repeating sections. Each segment began with a tower, followed by a timber section, and then a heavier stone wall. This pattern fitted well next to the harbor and helped the new defenses feel like a natural extension of the city. Unsurprisingly, I ran out of cobblestone again. By this point, my mining area had become an enormous artificial cave. I planned to convert it into an XP farm eventually, which made destroying half the underground terrain feel slightly more productive. Constructing the full wall involved repeating the same process for a very long time. So instead of forcing everyone to watch me place thousands of blocks, I completed most of it in a building montage. When the final section connected to the harbor, the entire settlement was enclosed. The stone towers, stone walls, and raised walkways made the city appear fortified without hiding the natural landscape. I was extremely pleased with the result, but the settlement still had another major problem. It looked empty. A city cannot survive on workshops, taverns, and a defensive wall. It needed homes. I began filling the empty areas with smaller residential buildings. Each home followed the same general design rule. The corners and structural supports were made from spruce logs, the walls used spruce planks, and every roof was steep enough to survive a dramatic Scandinavian winter. Of course, each roof also received the city's signature wooden horns. Although the basic palette remained consistent, I varied the shapes, heights, and orientations of the houses. Some were narrow, some were wider, some contained small extensions or storage areas. This helped the settlement feel as though it had developed naturally rather than being planned as one perfectly organized Minecraft grid. Because the island contained very few natural trees, the city looked exposed and unfinished. I had collected enough spruce saplings to create an artificial forest around the outer buildings. so I began planting trees one section at a time. The growing forest added contrast to the stone and timber structures, while also making the city feel much more established. Every house required additional fences, trapdoors, doors, supports, and wooden decorations. These smaller details used more spruce than expected, which meant I continued farming trees throughout the entire construction process. The inner city contained several natural hills that I did not want to remove. Instead, I incorporated them into the buildings. I carved semi-underground homes into the slopes and used wooden entrances and roofs to make them appear as though the inhabitants had built directly into the landscape. It was important that these structures did not form perfect straight lines. Real settlements develop unevenly, especially when buildings have to adapt to hills and cliffs, so I scattered the houses organically across the terrain. I also created several structures that consisted almost entirely of roofs, emerging from the hillside. These complemented the more traditional houses and added much more variety to the residential district. With each completed building, the settlement became more convincing. The new forest grew around the walls, pathways developed between the houses, and empty landscapes slowly transformed into a living Viking village. But the ordinary citizens were not the only people who needed a home. The town also required a chief. I selected the highest flat area inside the walls and began constructing a larger hall, almost entirely from logs. Because the structure was heavier and more important than the surrounding houses, I designed a steep, rounded roof using a mixture of full blocks and stairs. I stripped every second log, creating texture and preventing the walls from appearing completely flat. The finished hall looked powerful without being unrealistically enormous. It fitted naturally above the residential district and gave the city a clear focal point. I added several more houses to complete the neighborhood. The role-playing concept was now clear. Most of the population lived within the hilly upper section of the settlement, while social and commercial buildings occupied the flatter ground beside the harbor. With a tavern, workshop, docks, and future marketplace formed the public center of the town. Before constructing the final mega build, I needed one last large supply of spruce. I sailed to a nearby spruce forest rather than cutting down the trees around my settlement. The artificial forest had finally grown into the shape I wanted, and destroying it for the resources would have ruined the city's surroundings. The harbor had enough room for 2 additional longships. I wanted them to appear as though they were being prepared for another expedition. Thanks to the sheep farm, I had enough wool to create more sails. I used the original longship as the foundation for both designs, but changed their dimensions and details so the harbor would not contain 3 identical ships. The first new vessel sat beneath the large crane. This created the impression that workers were loading supplies and preparing it to leave. While constructing it, I realized that the residential district still contained an empty slope. A small vineyard would fit perfectly there. Vineyards might not be the first thing people associate with Vikings, but the technique worked well with the shape of the terrain and added another layer of life to the settlement. I used a design method from one of my older projects and adopted it to the city. The third ship was slightly smaller but followed the same overall style as the other 2. With 3 longships, a workshop, a crane, a large dock, the harbor finally looked active. It felt as though the ships could leave at any moment and return carrying goods from distant lands. Only one major building remained. The final mega build was the trading hall. Vikings were not only raiders, they were also travelers and traders who exchanged goods across enormous distances. Because of that, the city needed a marketplace large enough to reflect its importance. I began with an extremely long wooden structure. The central section formed the main body of the hall, while both sides were slightly smaller. Between the main spruce supports, I planned spaces for individual market stalls. This allowed the shops to become part of the building rather than sitting randomly around it. The 2 side sections received enormous steep roofs. The central roof was even taller, which made the middle of the building immediately recognizable as the main entrance. It was one of the most colorful parts of the city, which made sense for a location filled with imported goods, fabrics, food, and valuable materials. The main structure was complete. I decorated it with fences, trapdoors, lanterns, barrels, chests, and small merchandise displays. Then I added more pathways throughout the city. I connected the houses, harbor, tavern, chief's hall, and marketplace so that the settlement felt walkable. The final empty spaces were filled with trees, bushes, grass, and small natural details. These additions were easy to overlook, but they were essential. Without them, even a detailed Minecraft city can feel like a collection of buildings placed on an empty lawn. Once the landscaping was complete, I climbed to a nearby viewpoint and looked over the entire project. It had turned out better than I had expected. There was only one thing missing: a population. Buildings were finished, the harbor was protected, the ships were ready. But no matter how detailed the city looked, it still felt abandoned without inhabitants. So I returned to the original village and asked two friendly villagers whether they wanted to relocate. They were extremely happy about my proposal. I transported them across the water to their new home. They seemed to enjoy the journey, although it was difficult to interpret their expressions. Once they arrived, I created several small fields and placed workstations around the settlement. This gave the villagers professions and allowed them to begin their new lives inside the city. More importantly, the settlement finally felt alive. By the end of the 100 days, the empty coastline had been completely transformed. A small natural harbor had become a fortified port containing 2 Viking longships. The docks contained an enormous workshop, a functional crane, storage areas, and enough detail to make the entire district feel alive. On the other side stood a warm tavern where warriors could return after long expeditions. Massive wooden and stone walls protected the settlement, while watchtowers overlooked the surrounding landscape. Inside those walls were hillside homes, traditional wooden houses, a vineyard, a forest, a chief's hall, farms, and a giant marketplace filled with colorful stalls. And for once, I had survived long enough to finish everything. This was my first Minecraft hardcore adventure, where I placed as much emphasis on building as I did on survival. The entire project took almost 25 hours to complete, and I was incredibly happy with the result. So if you enjoyed watching this Viking city rise from an empty coastline, consider leaving a like and subscribing. I also look forward to reading your comments about this project. I also like to hear some new ideas for future hardcore projects if you're interested. But for now, the work was finished, the walls were standing, the ships were waiting. The first inhabitants began their new lives. So sit back and enjoy one final tour of the Viking city. Until next time.